On January 23rd, 2005, which is actually a day that is remembered by the people of New York as Black Sunday, Curtis Myron, who was a New York City firefighter, was trapped on the 4th floor of an apartment in the Bronx. Blazing inferno. He, along with 5 other firefighters, are trapped on the top floor. There was no way out, and they elected to jump from the 4th floor. And unfortunately, Curtis, along with another firefighter, did not survive the fall. In addition to those 2 lives that were lost, another fire had broken out separately in New York the same day that claimed the life of a 3rd firefighter. This was the largest loss of life for the New York City Fire Department since the September 11th attacks. Curtis's wife, Jeanette, and their 2 daughters, Angela, who was a young teenager, and Deneen, who was a little bit younger than Angela, they were inconsolable. They never thought that their father, their husband, would not come home again. But they were faced with this horrible new reality where Dad wasn't coming home. The Black Sunday tragedy, the loss of those 3 firefighters, had become very high profile, and so news channels and media outlets were showing up at Jeanette's property hoping to get an interview with she or her kids about what had happened, and they were just not interested in that. And so they felt very trapped inside of the house. And the house itself had been built by Curtis. He had literally built the house, and so it was just a constant reminder of the sadness of this loss. And at some point, Jeanette just said to the girls, I think we should move. I think we just need a fresh start. This is too much. It's too much to be here. Let's just move. And the girls were very eager to leave. So Jeanette starts doing some house hunting, and quickly she finds this nice little house on Long Island where they live, but farther away from the city. And it was sitting on an acre of land, which for the price that was being asked for it, it was unheard of. They went to the property, and Jeanette could see that the house needed a ton of work. But all of Kurt's firefighter buddies were very eager to support Jeanette and her kids, and they offered to come by and actually help them do the renovations on the house. And so Jeanette bought the house, and very quickly she and her 2 daughters moved in, and all of Kurt's firefighter buddies showed up and began this massive house renovation. I mean, they were basically tearing it down to the studs and rebuilding the whole house. Because of this massive renovation project, a lot of the doors and windows were not secured, and so at night Jeanette felt really uncomfortable, so she went out and purchased 7 cameras to fit on the outside of the house to monitor the property, and all of the cameras streamed to her laptop where she could watch them at any time. And so she found herself watching these cameras a lot on her laptop, just kind of reflexively watching what was happening around her property. And so one night, Jeanette's at her house, her kids are upstairs, and she's got her laptop open and she's watching these feeds from the 7 different cameras, and she admitted that it was just kind of fun to watch the cameras. It felt, kind of cool to see what was going on outside, but from the safety of your home. And she was watching one particular feed that was showing the edge of her property where there was this big forest that basically butted up against their property, where there was a swing set in their driveway, and she was looking out at this big open front yard of theirs. And from the tree line, she watched a figure emerge it looked like a man in a cloak, walk up to their driveway and walk a little ways down the driveway before stopping and staring up at the house. Jeanette was so caught off guard by what she was seeing that she didn't do anything. She just stood there watching this figure. And as soon as the figure had gotten there and was watching the house, it turned back around and walked back into the woods and vanished. It was late. Jeanette didn't know what she'd even seen. The cameras were not super HD, so she thought it must have been an animal or it was just an anomaly of the camera itself. So at the same time that Jeanette is looking at her laptop and she's trying to make sense of this figure she's seen, upstairs, the 2 girls are in their own bedrooms, which are on other ends of the hallway. Angela was laying on her bed with her back up against the wall and she's reading a book, and she starts hearing tapping along the same wall that her back is against, and she can almost feel it in her back. She puts her book down and sits forward and turns and is listening really intently to where the tapping had been coming from. And then she hears bang, 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 like someone's trying to get her attention. She gets right out of her bed and goes to her door. She opens it up and looks downstairs, because from where her door opened, she could look into the living room on the 1st floor. And immediately she saw her mom on her laptop. Her mom was not banging on anything. And her sister was in her room and she was down the hall. And so that couldn't have been her sister. So she goes back in her room and she's thinking to herself, I'm hearing things. She puts her ear right up against the wall, and as soon as her ear makes contact with the wall, she said it sounded like someone smashed the wall right on the other side of her ear. It causes her to freak out, and she goes right into her bed and throws the covers over her head and she hides. What Angela didn't know is that down the hall, her younger sister Deneen had heard tapping as well, but her tapping sounds were not coming from the wall, they were coming from the door. And she thought her mom had come upstairs to see what she was doing. So she got up, walked to the door, opened it up, and there was nothing. She did the same thing that Angela did and poked her head down and saw her mom sitting on the couch. She looked down the hall and she saw that Angela's door was closed. It wasn't Angela. So she shuts the door, and as soon as it shuts, she hears 3 distinct taps on the door. She opens it up again, there's no one there. She too runs into her bed and jumps under the covers. The girls would say in interviews that the tapping sounds continued periodically throughout most of the night, but at some point they both managed to fall asleep under the covers. The next morning, the girls go downstairs and they're in the kitchen and they tell each other what they had heard the night before. And they both start feeding off of each other because they both had this experience and didn't realize it. Angela would say to Deneen, yeah, I heard these tapping sounds. Deneen is picking up on her fear and she's saying, I heard tapping sounds. And the kids are really wound up. And that's when Jeanette comes into the kitchen and she sees her kids talking about something that seems really intense. And she goes, what's going on? What are you talking about? And they said, Mom, we think something's wrong with the house. We heard tapping sounds last night. This happened to me. This happened to me. And Jeanette just says, guys, it's a brand new house. We aren't used to the sounds the house makes. I'm sure it's just pipes or, creaking floorboards or something. You guys are overthinking it. Don't worry about a thing. The house is fine. Over the following few days, some of the firemen that were helping renovate the house began to work on the basement. The basement was full of clutter. It was like whoever had lived there before had never taken anything out. Very old pieces of machinery and furniture and strange boxes and papers. And the first step to fixing the basement was just going to be emptying it. And so the firemen were removing things from the basement when one of them, his name was Tom, he was one of Kurt's very good friends, Tom discovered that on the ground underneath all the clutter was this large pentagram, which is a 5-pointed star inside of a circle that is almost always associated with satanic worship. Tom gets Jeanette to come downstairs and he shows her what's on the ground and he says, what do you want me to do about this? And Jeanette said, paint over it. I don't want my kids to see this. But what Jeanette didn't know is that the kids had actually been playing outside over the past couple of days out in that forest in their property. And they had found a number of pentagrams carved into trees, into rocks, carved into the dirt on the ground. They were everywhere. They decided not to tell their mom because they didn't want their mom to worry. So they're both siloing information about these pentagrams all over their property. A couple of days later, Angela was going to be home alone for a few hours. And Jeanette had given Angela some chores, which included cleaning out the refrigerator. And so Angela's in the kitchen and she's got the fridge open and she's taking things out and cleaning off each of the different drawers. And she can't help but feel like someone is standing behind her. She kept turning around and no one was standing in the kitchen, but she just could not shake this feeling that someone was behind her. And so she's looking at the fridge at one point and she's about to just give up on cleaning the fridge and explain to her mom that she would just do it later, when all of a sudden she hears behind her this loud explosion. She hears pots and pans and knives and forks clattering all over the ground, and she instantly turns around and every cabinet, every drawer has come flying open and all of their contents have come smashing onto the floor. She sprints up to her bedroom screaming and hides in the corner. Shortly thereafter, Jeanette comes home. She goes inside and she sees the kitchen is an absolute mess. It looks like someone had broken in, and she starts screaming for Angela, thinking the worst. Someone's broken in. What happened to my daughter? She's running upstairs screaming for Angela. She finds Angela curled up in the corner of her bedroom. What's going on? What happened in the kitchen? And Angela just could not put an answer together. She was so shocked by what happened. So Jeanette tells her to stay here. She runs around the house, making sure that no one's there. She gets her laptop, goes back to Angela, opens it up, and she checks the footage. No one's in their house. No one's been near their house. All the while, Angela's just sobbing hysterically. And finally, after Jeanette is convinced that there has not been a home invasion, she turns to Angela and she's like, what is going on? Why does the kitchen look like this? And Angela tried to explain what happened, but it just didn't make any sense. And so Jeanette was getting frustrated with Angela and saying, did you do that down in the kitchen? But when Angela didn't change her story and just looked terrified, Jeanette started to see that Angela wasn't lying. This incident really rattled Angela, and Jeanette would comment in different interviews that it was at this point that Angela began to withdraw quite a bit. She was really upset about what had happened in the kitchen, but there wasn't really a good way to handle it, and so Jeanette didn't know what to say to her daughter. Angela didn't know how to talk about it, and so it was just this awful cloud in their life that they had this really intense thing happen, but there's just no explanation for it. A couple of days after the kitchen incident, and the crew that had been clearing out the basement got to the point where they were ready to actually start tearing down drywall. And so as they start demoing the walls, they find hidden in the walls a journal. And it's this very old looking journal with some lace wrapped around it. And one of the firemen gives it to Jeanette and just says, hey, I thought you might want to look at this. I don't know what to make of it, but it was in your wall. Jeanette opened it up and she began flipping through it, and she saw a date that was 1927. And she knew that was actually the date that this house was actually built. It seemed like this was a journal written by someone named Christina, who seemed fairly young. And as she's flipping through this journal, it really starts to take a dark turn when she sees diagrams of these ritualistic sacrifices of animals and of people that apparently were taking place in this house, because the diagram clearly indicated that it was happening in the basement. And even weirder is there was this room that they didn't know what it was for in the basement that was underneath the stairs, that it wasn't really a closet. It was all cement on all four sides. It was like someone had put a pocket of cement underneath the stairs, and they always wondered what it was. And some of the diagrams indicated that some of the sacrificing was going on underneath the stairs in that room. Jeanette decides to keep the journal from her kids. She does not want them to know that this was found in the walls. A couple of days later, Angela is in her bedroom listening to music on her headphones, and at some point she thinks she hears someone call her name. She takes her headphones out, she goes to the door, opens up, looks down and says, hey mom, did you call me? And her mom's like, no. She looks down the hall and she can hear that her sister is showering in the bathroom at the end of the hall, so it wasn't her. And so, Angela, she has a healthy fear of this house because of really the kitchen incident more than anything else. But she's thinking, okay, I must have heard something, not a big deal. So she goes back into her room and she sits down in her bed, but before putting her headphones back in, she hears someone say, get Deneen. And it's coming from in the walls. Immediately, she's terrified. Down the hall, she hears Deneen, who's in the shower, screaming bloody murder. Angela starts running to the bathroom to see what's going on with Deneen, right as Jeanette is flying up the stairs to go see what's going on with Deneen. They open up the door and Deneen is huddled on the ground screaming about some person in the bathroom with her. And she kept turning around and no one was there. Jeanette would say when she saw her daughter, she looked so scared she thought she was having a seizure. And Jeanette immediately grabs a towel, scoops up her daughter, she grabs Angela, and they leave the bathroom. They go running into Jeanette's room, and they get into Jeanette's bed, and they're all huddled there, and Jeanette's trying to ask Deneen what she saw. And so Deneen finally says that she was in the shower, and she heard someone saying her name, and it sounded like a male voice. And she's just looking through the frosted glass, and all of a sudden she sees a big hand land on the outside of the shower door. Jeanette felt so helpless. She had lost her husband, her kids have lost their father, and there's all these strange things happening in the house, and Jeanette just felt like she couldn't protect them. It was around this time that Jeanette really felt like she should leave the house. But financially, they were really invested into this house, so it would have been very difficult to leave just financially. And then also, the amount of time and energy all the firefighters, all of Kurt's friends had put into renovating the house and gutting it and fixing it up. It was so much time and energy that she felt like she would be letting them down if she left. And she couldn't possibly tell them that the reason that she was leaving is because the house is haunted. And so she just felt trapped. A couple of days go by and everybody is just on edge in the house. Angela, Deneen, Jeanette, they don't like being there. And Angela just felt really cooped up when she was home, and she was just scared of being in the house. And so one night she decides to go outside and just swing on their swing, which was on their front property. Jeanette is inside the house doing dishes where there's a window that looks out the front of the house where you can see this swing set. When she finishes doing the dishes, she takes her eye off of Angela for a moment and she walks into the other room to sit down on the couch. She grabs her laptop, she opens it up and figures she can keep an eye on Angela using the security camera that was pointing in that direction. So she opens up the program and she pulls up all the camera feeds, and she's shocked when on the camera feed with Angela, she sees the same cloaked figure she had seen the first time she'd been looking at the live feeds, standing right behind Angela. And immediately she's up and sprinting outside, screaming for Angela. As soon as she gets outside, she hears Angela screaming for her mother before she's even seen her mother. And when she turns the corner, she sees Angela screaming in pain on the ground in front of the swing, and there's no cloaked figure anywhere. She runs over and she can see that Angela's ankle has been badly broken or dislocated. And so she scoops her up and she said, "What happened?" And Angela said that somebody pushed me. Someone pushed me off the swing. And they go to the hospital, and sure enough, she had dislocated and broken her ankle. When they got home that night, Jeanette opened up the laptop and reviewed the footage from outside. And she saw this figure walk out of the woods, and the swing was right up against the woods. And it goes right behind Angela and appears to push Angela and then goes back into the woods. Jeanette called the police. She showed them the footage, and they feel really bad, and they can clearly see what happened. But there's no way to identify the figure that came out of the tree line. They just told them to be careful, don't go in your woods, and if you see this figure again in any of your camera feeds, call us right away and we'll come right over and we'll do what we can. So at this point, Jeanette is terrified. She can't protect her kids, and she doesn't leave them really at any point. She's 24/7 in the same room with her kids. They're sleeping in the same room, and the only time she would leave them is during the day for very brief stints. And on one day, a couple of days after the swing incident, Jeanette needed to go to the pharmacy, and so Angela's going to be alone for about an hour and a half. And so her mom leaves, and Angela is in her bedroom, and she's sitting on her bed and she's listening to music. At some point, she thinks she hears banging coming from somewhere in her room. Now, at this point, Angela's been pretty shaken up after living here. She had the incident in the kitchen where everything flew out of the drawers and cupboards. She's been hearing tapping and banging sounds. She has her sister's story about the hand on the glass in the shower. She just got pushed off a swing by some cloaked figure. I mean, she's scared of this place. And so every sound is going to terrify her. And when she started hearing that tapping sound, she took out her headphones. She looks over at her closet and she can see that the doors are rattling. She is so immediately scared that she gets off of the bed and goes underneath and tucks up against the side of the wall. She could actually see the bottom of the closet, and she can see it still rattling, and she's tucked up against the wall. And as she's looking, the doors slowly slide open, and she sees a figure walk out of her closet that must have been standing there the whole time that she'd been laying on her bed. She said this horrible smell filled the room, and she said that it looked like it had human feet, bare feet. But it was a totally dark figure. It was hard to really pick out if it looked human or not, but it began walking around her room. And she believed it was looking for her. And she heard its footsteps as it walked all over her room. And at some point, it walks into the hall out of her bedroom. And she's just laying there under her bed, hoping that it doesn't come back. And then when she thinks it's walked all the way downstairs, it goes quiet. And then she hears it running up the stairs, running into her bedroom, runs right in front of the bed. Its feet are aimed right at her. It climbs onto her bed. She can hear the springs condensing right above her. And she's looking out wide-eyed, holding her mouth. And all of a sudden, its head appears looking down directly at her. And it's this dark face, sunken eyes. It looks like its skin is rotting off of its head. And it's just staring at her upside down, looking directly at her. At this point, she screams and the figure goes back up onto the bed, and now it's sitting right above her. She's screaming uncontrollably, and then she hears it get off the bed, but she doesn't know where it went in the room. And so for the next 45 minutes, she lays there expecting this thing to come back. It knows where she is. It knows she's under the bed. And she can hear it occasionally running around the house. She can just smell this horrible smell. And at some point she hears her mom's car outside and she starts screaming for her mother. Her mother must have heard her because she comes bombing into the house. She runs up the stairs. She's screaming for Angela. Angela's screaming for her mom. And then she finally finds Angela under the bed. She pulls her out. She holds her and she's trying to figure out what's going on. And Angela's saying that he's in the house. He's in the house. He's in the house. I don't know what it is. He came out of my closet. Jeanette runs all through the house looking for anything or anyone in the house. There's nothing. It's gone. At this point, Jeanette is at her wit's end. She doesn't know what to do. So she takes Angela, she gets in the car, they drive to where Deneen is. Deneen was with a friend at the time. They get Deneen, so the three of them are together now, and they drive to Jeanette's parents' house. And while they're there, Jeanette calls a paranormal investigator, and she says, I need your help. I need help to get rid of what's going on in my house. And so she gets in touch with this woman named Liz, who offers to do a cleansing of the house. And after the cleansing was done, Jeanette would say that it appeared that everything stopped in the house. And somewhat unbelievably, Jeanette and Angela and Deneen decided to stay in the house where this demon was. That they felt confident that the cleansing had gotten rid of it, And to this day, they still live there. If it was me, I would have been out of that house and never gone back. In 2014, Aaron Hedges was 38 years old, he lived in Montana, and he was an avid hunter. During the hunting season, Aaron was known to spend almost every weekend or every other weekend hunting in one particular area known as the Crazy Mountains, or the Crazies for short. The Crazies are a mountain range in Montana that are actually disconnected from the Rocky Mountains, so they're very isolated, and they're beautiful, but they're incredibly rugged and very steep. Aaron knew this area like the back of his hand because he was there all the time hunting. In fact, he was there so often that he began placing caches of sleeping bags, food, water. He cached this all over the Crazies. And he knew how to get to his cache points without the use of a map. He just could look around and know where he was, and he could walk to his cache point. On September 3rd, 2014, Aaron, along with two of his close friends, decided to go on a hunting trip to the Crazies for a week. They planned on staying right next to this lake called Campfire Lake, but in order to get to it, they had to hike into the Crazies. You could not drive a car to where they were going to stay. So they got 2 horses and a pack mule, and Aaron loaded much of his gear onto the pack mule. And so they begin this hike up to Campfire Lake. And a little ways into this first day hike, the mule spooks at something and runs away. In the process of running away from them, it ditched all of their equipment all over the place, and they couldn't recover it all. Now, after they gathered up what they could and got the mule back and continued their walk, Aaron decided he didn't feel like going to one of his cache points to try to retrieve an extra sleeping bag, and he said, I'm just going to use whatever extra gear you guys have, I'll make do. And so they continue on, they get to Campfire Lake, and they set up their camp, and for the first couple of days, everything is going just fine. On the 3rd day, Aaron decided that, you know what, I could tough it out, but I'm just going to go north to one of my cache points and get that extra sleeping bag and try to get a few other things that were lost and make my living arrangements a little bit more comfortable while I'm here. And so his 2 buddies, they know that Aaron is in this section of the Crazies all the time. And so they didn't bat an eye when he says he's going to go off on his own. It wasn't a very far distance to this cache point. They said, okay, we'll see you later tonight. So Aaron takes off, and after a little while, one of his buddies, for whatever reason, uses his radio to reach out to Aaron. The walkie-talkies they were using had this LED screen that anytime you transmitted traffic on it, it would register your GPS location and transmit that to the person you're talking to. So when he hailed Aaron at about 10 in the morning after he had left to go up to his cache point, when Aaron radioed back, it showed up on their LED screen that instead of going north to this cache point, he had deviated and gone very far to the east. And he would say on the radio, Aaron would say back to them, hey guys, I got mixed up and I missed the turn to go up to the cache point. I'm trying to find the trail to get back to the cache point. But they expect him, based on what he said, that he was just going to turn and go to the cache point and come back to where they were at some point that night. But here's the first weird thing about this case. Aaron got turned around and basically missed the turn at this really obvious fork in the trail. If you go this way, you'll get to your cache. If you go this way, you'll end up where Aaron is, and it's the complete wrong way. And you know it's the wrong way because on your right-hand side, if you're going this way, there's going to be a creek on your right. Whereas if you go towards the cache, you're going uphill and there's no creek. So for Aaron, in perfect weather conditions, to have missed a very obvious fork in the road that he knows well is a little bit strange. Not to mention where he showed up on their GPS when they talked to him on the radio, he was a ways down the wrong direction. He would have been next to that creek for long enough that he should have already turned around. It's like making a wrong turn and going 45 minutes to an hour in the wrong direction when you already know it's the wrong direction. Why are you still going that way? But his friends were not that concerned. They had just spoken to him on the radio. He's saying, I got turned around. They're expecting him now to show up a little bit later in the day, maybe in the evening at some point. So that night when he doesn't show up, they try radioing him and they can't get through to him. And they decide that, you know what, it's not that easy to call authorities. They didn't have cell reception out there, and it would have been about a day's hike before they could even get to a place where they could call authorities. So they decide, let's just stay here tonight. He could show up at any point in the middle of the night, and tomorrow, if he's not here, we'll go looking for him. The next morning, his friends get up. This is on September 6th. There's no Aaron. So they head off in the direction of this cache and they start looking for Aaron. And all day they're calling for him. They're trying to radio him. Nothing, no sign of him. The following morning on the 7th, they do leave the area. They give up on their hunting trip and they head out of the Crazies to contact authorities. Authorities launched this massive search for Aaron. But as soon as they launched this search, this massive storm rolls in, dumping 2 feet of snow within the first 12 hours of their search. So they really weren't able to accomplish much in those first 2 days, which brings us to September 9th. One of the main areas that they were looking for Aaron was following that path that he had gone down, the wrong path away from his cache. They followed that path down along that creek and were looking for anywhere along the creek that he might have been. And there was this cliff that overlooked the creek, and on this cliff, next to a tree, they found Aaron's boots, neatly placed side by side as if put there intentionally. Next to his boots was a very obvious fire pit where someone had started a fire. In the fire pit was a cigarette container that was Aaron's brand. It looks every bit like Aaron had been here, smoked a cigarette, took his boots off for some reason, and had been sitting next to this fire. Also next to the fire was Aaron's Camelback water bladder, as well as some of the straps that went to his backpack that had been burned inside of the fire pit. But there's no sign of Aaron or his remains anywhere near there. Also, the people who found the boots in the fire said that we were in this specific area over the past 2 days. This wasn't here. At this point, investigators believed that Aaron must have been suffering from severe hypothermia, where in severe cases, people are known to actually strip their clothing. And so searchers created a new search area based on his boots, thinking he had to have been at this fire pit smoking a cigarette. He took his boots off because he's got hypothermia, and he wandered off, but he can't have gotten far. We're talking 2 feet of snow on the ground in rugged terrain, and he's barefoot. But despite searching extensively in their new search area, they couldn't find Aaron or any sign of him. 9 months later, a family, the Rhines family, who lived near the base of the crazy mountain range, they were doing their yearly maintenance on their fence that went around their entire property. And one of the family members decided to take a break from the work and walk up into the crazies just a little ways up to just sit on the mountain and look out across the land. It was a beautiful view. And as he's walking up, he gets about a mile from the property itself, and he spots an orange vest under a tree. And so he figures a hunter must have lost their gear. So he walks up and he sees that not only is there an orange hunting vest laying on the ground, but there is a backpack that would turn out to be Aaron Hedges' backpack leaning up against a tree, as if placed there on purpose. Inside of the pack was Aaron Hedges' wallet and license, along with a loaded gun and food and water. Next to the pack, there was this rock. And on the rock was a thermos that was open, along with an open energy drink. As if Aaron had set his pack down and then sat on this rock and was sipping an energy drink out of his thermos. If Aaron had been sitting on that rock, as it appears he was, you can clearly see the Rhines property a mile away from you. It's right in front of you. It would be impossible not to see. Additionally, this location was 6 miles away from where Aaron's boots were found. So all of Aaron's gear is brought to the authorities, who go out and they look for Aaron, and there's no sign of Aaron in the area. Another year would go by and a couple of horseback riders would be riding past that same area where the backpack was found, and they see a human skull sitting underneath a tree. Sure enough, it winds up being Aaron Hedges' skull, and his skeletal remains were all there, except for his feet. His feet were never found, but the coroner could not determine a cause of death. So a couple of questions come to mind. How did Aaron, a guy that knows the crazies inside and out, make that wrong turn in the first place? He should have known better. But even if we say he got turned around, it can happen to the best of us, he would have known he was going in the wrong direction because the creek would be on his right, but he kept going because we find his campsite with his boots way down the path that was in the wrong direction. But even if we're willing to accept that as why he was at that campsite, he took off his boots. And then he walked 6 miles in 2 feet of snow to a location that was literally looking at safety. The Rhines property is right there. You have food, you have water, and you're sitting there drinking a drink. You have a loaded gun, you can fire it into the air to try to get someone's attention, but you don't use your resources, you don't go to safety, you die. In 2018, Terrence Woods was a 27-year-old filmmaker / journalist who had, ever since graduating college, traveled the world, filming in locations that are very rugged and sometimes quite dangerous for these documentaries and TV shows that he was known to work on. In October of that year, Terrence was going to travel to Idaho, with a production company called Raw TV. They were doing a TV series around an abandoned gold mine called the Penman Mine. Penman Mine was located in an area that is quite rugged in the middle of the backcountry. Terrence had previously worked on 2 different backcountry shoots. One was done in Turkey and the other was done in Alaska. So he wasn't an expert by any means, but he was accustomed to being out in the wilderness to do some of these shoots. Prior to leaving for the trip, he had texted a number of his friends and just said he wasn't really that excited about going on the trip. His friends would later say to investigators that his language was not alarming. He was just kind of complaining about not wanting to go on a particular work trip, so it didn't stand out to them at all. Terrence arrives in Idaho in early October. He texts his father to let him know that he's landed, he's made it to the hotel. Everything seems to be going normally. He was supposed to be there until mid-November, and that's what everybody in his circle was expecting. So on October 5th, when Terrence sent a text to his father that just said, "I'm going to be coming home on October 10th," and there was no explanation, his father wondered why. And so he wrote a response and said, "Why are you cutting your trip short?" But he never got a response because Terrence had actually already left for the day on October 5th to go do a shoot at this mine, and he'd be out of cell phone reception. On October 5th, the crew that was around Terrence all day reported that he was acting very strangely. He was very quiet, withdrawn, wasn't really talking to anybody. And at the end of the day, when they were wrapping up shooting, one of the producers was sitting in a vehicle waiting for everyone to kind of finish up, packing up, and Terrence said he wanted to go relieve himself. And he walked over to the edge of this cliff, and for whatever reason, this producer, he didn't know why, but he just thought he needed to look to see if Terrence was okay. And he turns to look where Terrence was standing at the edge of this cliff, and Terrence isn't there anymore, and he sees Terrence's radio is now sitting on the ground standing there. And there was just something about the scene that he saw that he instinctively knew something's wrong, and he actually ran up the cliff in case Terrence had fallen off of it. But when he got to the edge of the cliff and looked over, he was shocked to see that Terrence was down there, about 15 feet down, but wasn't laying on the ground like he had fallen. He was sprinting down the hill, not saying a word, not looking up, running at full speed down the hill into the forest. The producer didn't know what to do. He kind of yelled to some other people and said, "Hey, what's Terrence doing?" No one knew. And so the producer and somebody else also began chasing after Terrence. But after a little while, they couldn't catch up to him, and they were worried that by chasing after him, they might scare him. And so instead, they immediately go and they call authorities, and this huge search is launched for Terrence. So for a week, you have all these people looking for Terrence. You have people on foot, you have dog teams, you have a helicopter with infrared technology. You have all these people combing this area, and there's no sign of Terrence. One of the search and rescue officers commented that it would have been so hard to get away from this search because the ground inside of that forest was so covered with fallen trees that there were times where you were just walking on fallen trees. You weren't even touching the ground. And so the idea that Terrence could run in there and effectively evade this massive search that had kind of encircled the area, it just didn't make any sense. But there was just no trace of him. And to this day, we have no idea where he went. There's never been a sign of what happened to Terrence. He just started running away for reasons we don't understand and disappeared. On the same day that Terrence Woods goes missing, 56 miles away in the same mountain range, a 76-year-old woman named Connie Johnson also goes missing under very strange circumstances. Connie was an outdoors woman through and through. She had previously worked as a wilderness ranger for the U.S. Forest Service, and she was known to take young people out on trips along the backcountry and teach them how to survive. Her friends said that she had tremendous survival skills and spent much of her time alone in the woods. Connie was working as a camp cook for Ritchie Outfitters. It was a company that organized hunting trips in the Idaho and Montana backcountry. The camp that she was actually working at was not accessible by vehicle. You had to get there on foot or on horseback. On October 2nd, all of the hunters at the Ritchie Outfitters camp that she was working in left for a 3-day hunting trip. They said bye to her and bye to her dog Ace, and they were gone. She was the only person at the camp. The following day, they got a very strange radio transmission from Connie. They couldn't understand what she was saying. They couldn't tell if she was mumbling or if there was something wrong, or maybe it could have been the radio. But when no one could understand what she was saying, they ultimately said, "Okay, I'm sure she's fine." And so a couple days go by, and on October 5th, the hunting party returns to the cabin, and Connie's gone, as well as her dog Ace. They're both gone. All they could find was Connie's jacket was laying over her gun that was sitting on a picnic table. That was it. A very intense search was launched that included the National Guard, the Air Force, helicopters, dog teams, ground searchers. They couldn't find her or her dog. And so on October 16th, they called off the search. 3 weeks later, Ace, her dog, would show up 15 miles away from where they had gone missing. The dog was emaciated, but was okay. They fed the dog, and then they tried to get the dog to help them find Connie, but to no avail. To this day, we have no idea where Connie went or why she left the camp to begin with. In February of 2008, the Pilkington family, which was David and Camilla, along with their two sons, Timothy and William, who was 7 years old, were on vacation on the west coast of Vancouver Island. They were staying in this tiny little town called Tofino, which was at the end of one of the peninsulas on the island. There was maybe 20 streets in the town. There was only a handful of places that you could stay. Everybody knew everybody on the island. I mean, it was really a tiny place. One morning, David wakes up early and decides he wants to take both of his sons down to one of Tofino's beaches. And so he gets Timothy and William, they walk over and they go down this flight of steps that leads down onto the beach itself. And when they get to the bottom of the steps, William says he wants to stay at the foot of the stairs. Timothy wants to go actually walk around the beach with David. And so David couldn't convince William to come with him and with Timothy. And so he says, okay, William, you stay right here. I'm gonna go with Timothy for a couple of minutes and walk around the beach. So David and Timothy walked only about 10 or 15 meters away from William, who was just standing at the foot of the stairs, just watching his dad and his brother. And at some point, David would say that he turned his back on his son. He said it was maybe for a minute. And he was looking at Timothy and they were doing whatever they were doing. And then when he turned around, William wasn't there anymore. And so David instinctively runs over because there's nobody else down there. There's nowhere really for him to have gone. But he runs over, he's looking on the sides of the stairs. He can't find his son. You know, he's looking where he could have gone, and it only made sense for him to probably go up the stairs. It wouldn't have been long enough for him to get into the water. It'd only been about a minute he had turned his back. And so he goes up the stairs, he's looking around, he can't find his son. And this huge search is launched for this boy because this just happened. It's a very small area. They figure they can find this kid. The main area they were going to look was inside of the forest. Tofino had a very dense forest right in the middle of it. And since the beach butted up against the forest, they figured that the boy could have walked up the stairs and made it into the forest in that 1 minute that his father's back was turned. And so after an exhaustive search of this forest and there's no sign of him, unfortunately investigators began to look to the beach and were waiting for a body to wash up on shore because historically the only people that ever went missing in Tofino were either found in the forest or they washed up on the beach. Those are the only two places you can go. There isn't anywhere else you can go. But the boy never washed up on a beach and they never found a shred of evidence ever in the forest where that boy was. He just vanished. So unfortunately, like basically all of the missing 411 cases, you have a baffling set of circumstances with no clear resolution. We don't know what happened to these people, and we probably never will. In 2006, Susan Lewis and her daughter Jamie moved into a new home in Southern California. It was this nice little house that they referred to as their sanctuary. They loved it there. And shortly after moving in, Susan's new boyfriend, Matt, he moved in as well. Matt and Jamie got along great. Also, Matt had a daughter named Marie, who was the same age as Jamie. And so those two got along great. Susan and Matt are getting along great. One happy family living in this beautiful little home that they call their sanctuary. I mean, it's a charmed life. Everything would change when the peanut butter spilled. A few weeks after moving in, it's this beautiful summer day, and Matt and Jamie and Marie are all outside goofing around in the pool, and Susan steps away from them to go into the house to make lunch for the group. Susan goes into the kitchen, and she sees on the counter that a peanut butter jar had its lid off and had been turned on its side. And oddly enough, the peanut butter seemed to be running out of the jar like it had been melted. It was like in a liquid state, pouring out of the jar and had gone all over the ground. She felt the temperature in the air and it wasn't very hot. So she figures one of the kids must have come in here and for whatever reason, microwaved the peanut butter and then dumped it on the counter. And so she reflexively turns around. She's like, Jamie, her daughter, Jamie, get in here. Jamie comes inside and she's like, what, Mom? And she's like, did you do this? And Jamie would say that she literally laughed at her mom. Like, why would I do that? And her mom's like, well, I don't know. Do you know if Marie did this? And she's like, no, we've been outside. So she shoos her daughter away and she calls in Marie. And Marie too is like, no, I didn't touch the peanut butter. Susan ultimately just kind of says, okay, the kids don't want to own up to it. It's a great day today. I'm not going to let this ruin it. And so she's kind of rationalizing what's going on. She's thinking, okay, one of the kids must have knocked it over without meaning to, and maybe it was warmer in here and I just didn't realize it and it melted. Any number of things could have been the reason for this, but I just don't care. After cleaning up the peanut butter, Susan leaves the house and they, all four of them, spend the rest of the day goofing around outside near the pool. When they come back in the house later that day, they find that there have been cans that you would keep in your pantry, like canned food, stacked on each of the steps leading upstairs. They also find that there have been random objects placed all over the house in strange patterns. In the bathroom, they find shampoo bottles stacked on top of one another, hairbrushes arranged in a star pattern on the counter. They open the microwave and find peanut butter jars and other random canned foods and stuffed animals from the kids' rooms in the microwave. The cleaning materials underneath the sink had been pulled out and arranged in a height line from shortest to tallest on the kitchen floor. Also, there were just strange liquids all over the walls. It looked like maybe ketchup or other sauces. They couldn't really tell what it was, but it was sprayed all over the house. There was shampoo on the walls and soap on the walls. And so when Susan and Matt and the girls go inside, they think that someone's invaded their house. So they run back out again. They're kind of looking around the property, wondering what they should do. And no one's come near their property. And they would have seen someone come to their property. So they start filming it. They go in and they film what's going on. That's why we have all these pictures. And they have no idea what to make of this. Matt believes it's Jamie, so not his biological daughter. Susan believes it's his daughter, Marie, and it starts this awful conflict between Matt and Susan. This would be the start of what would turn out to be a major fracture in this family, because it just continued to grow. You got to put yourself in their position. If you're Matt or Susan, you don't want this to be anything other than one of the kids did this. If it's not one of the kids, it means you had an intruder in your home. If it's not an intruder, then what caused it? They believe that the other child is doing this. They believed it so much that they did not see reason, but more than that, it would keep Matt and Susan from handling this the way I think anyone should have, which is get the police involved. They don't. So they start cleaning it up, and the house was really a mess. So it took quite a while to clean it up. And they ultimately just kind of moved on in that way that people who are in denial move on because you're in denial. That's what they were doing. So a week passes since finding their house in disarray with cans and jars all over the place and liquids on the walls. And Jamie and Marie are spending some time together in Jamie's room. Marie was sitting at a desk that was next to the bed, and Jamie had a cup of coffee. She puts the cup of coffee down on the desk next to Marie and says, I have to go use the bathroom. She turns around, she walks out, she comes back, and Marie has her head down in her homework. She's not apparently paying attention to anything around her. And Jamie walks in and sees that the cup of coffee that had been sitting on the desk has now been thrown all over her bed. And there's only been one person inside of the room, and that's been Marie. She's like, Marie, what are you doing? Why'd you throw my coffee all over the bed? And Marie pokes her head up and she's like, what are you talking about? And she looks over at the coffee and she's just as surprised as Jamie is. She's like, I didn't do that. Jamie doesn't believe Marie. She's mad at her because Jamie believed that Marie was the one responsible for placing the cans and everything all over the house. And so this was just another example of her trying to get attention or something like that. Jamie leaves the room to get some bleach. She comes back and she puts the bleach down on her dresser. She had all her drawers open with her clothes out. And she has this bottle of bleach sitting right at the top of this dresser. And so she goes over to the bed, picks up the cup itself that had the coffee. She puts that back on the table, turns around to get the bleach, and the cap has been turned off and it's now dumping bleach all over her clothes. It's just pouring out. Marie had been sitting in the chair the whole time, and Jamie had seen her the whole time. And so when she sees the bleach dumping all over her clothes, she knows it could not have been Marie. So she screams. Marie looks over. She sees what's going on. She screams. Susan hears this and comes charging in the room, and she's like, what's going on? The girls can't describe what's going on. And as they're standing there, a picture frame falls off the wall. And it startles them all. They're looking over, and then another picture falls. It's one thing to have one picture fall, but to have two fall in close succession to one another, that's not a coincidence. Susan sees the pictures fall. She hears her kids in hysterics, and they run out of there. They get in the car and actually just leave the house because the girls just did not want to be there. This was a big moment in this story because to this point, Jamie, without saying anything, believed Marie was responsible for placing everything around the house and making a mess in the house. Marie felt the same way about Jamie. Again, they didn't say it to each other, but it's how they rationalized it. Susan was doing the same thing, but for both of the kids. She basically believed that either Marie or Jamie had placed the cans all over the house. Now, Susan is starting to believe that something else is going on in the house. And Marie and Jamie absolutely believe something is going on in the house. They actually suggested that we believe our house is haunted. At some point after driving around, Susan and Jamie and Marie go back to the house. Matt has been at work the whole time, so he's not there. When they get back to the house is once again covered in cans all up the stairs, placed in weird orientations on the ground, things in the microwave. The fridge has been opened, all the food's been dumped out. There's liquids all over the wall, and they hadn't been there. And neither had Matt. Now combine it with the fact that you just had this coffee and bleach incident and the picture's fallen off the wall. They're talking about the house being haunted. You can imagine what it was like to walk into that house and see it like that all over again when it could not have been Jamie or Marie or Susan. When Matt came home that night, he was just more convinced that it had to have been Marie or Jamie or even Susan, because Susan's acting like something's going on here, something paranormal's going on here, and he wasn't there. He didn't see the coffee and bleach incident. He didn't see the pictures falling off the wall. And now he sees his girlfriend kind of buying into this idea that it's some paranormal thing. He was a really intense skeptic and was just absolutely unwilling to see this as anything other than a bad prank that now his girlfriend is even getting in on. It causes a huge fight between him and Susan. He's like, why are you letting the kids doing this? Why are you feeding into this? She's saying, you don't get it. There's something wrong with this house. Practically at each other's throats, they pick the house up again. It takes forever. They put everything back. And by the end of it, it's like no one wants to talk to each other. The kids are fighting with each other. Susan and Matt practically hate each other. And that's how that night wraps up. That night, all the power went out in the house. And all they heard all night was doors banging nonstop. And their stove is set to light. So all you hear is that clicking sound. They couldn't get it to turn off. I mean, right in front of them. There's all this paranormal activity and they're recording it. And they have no idea what to do. Even though we view this story and say, come on guys, either this is an elaborate hoax or you gotta go to the police. You gotta do something right here. You're doing it wrong. You're in denial, you're fighting with each other. You can't do that. You gotta do something about this. But now put yourself in their position. Their world has been completely turned upside down. Everything they believed and understood about the world is being questioned right now. They are trying to hold on to every last shred of that former life and understanding of life that they had before this haunting began. And so they don't handle this well. They just continue to fight and to be at each other's throats, blaming each other for all the things that are blatantly happening in front of them that have nothing to do with Matt, Susan, Jamie, or Marie. So at this point, Susan and Matt and the girls have not told any of their friends or other family members about what's going on. So the next day, Susan would actually go to her close friend and say, here's what's going on, and I have no idea what to do. And her friend would say, maybe you ought to try giving it a peace offering. Maybe this thing in your house, feels like you're intruding. And if you offer some sort of peace offering to demonstrate that you mean no harm, that you want to coexist, that maybe it'll get along with you. Maybe it'll stop. So whether this was good advice or not, we don't know. But Susan finally has something that she has control over. And she really gets into this. She gets the girls. She knows Matt's going to be out for the day at work. And she knows Matt would not be cool with doing this. He would not believe that offering a peace offering is going to do any good. It would just cause more fights. And so she saw this window of time to take the girls and do this peace offering. She had this little figurine. It was a cat figurine. Susan loved cats, and she figured that a cat represented something she loved. And so it would be the perfect kind of deliberate, intentional offering showing that she means no harm, they mean no harm. Let's kind of call it truce here. And she puts candles on this table and she puts the cat right in the middle, and she doesn't know what to say or how to do it. And the girls are just sitting there like, what's happening here? And Susan just kind of says, please accept this gift. It's my gift to you. We mean no harm and we want to coexist. And it just so happens that as they're performing this kind of ritual, Matt came home. He had not slept the night before. It had been a really bad night with the slamming of doors and all that craziness. And so he left work early. He called in sick, basically. And he comes into the house and literally sees Susan doing this kind of ritual with his daughter and his stepdaughter, and he immediately goes to like, absolutely not. We're not going to go to trying to interact with this thing. We're not going to act like it's real. It's not real. And so he goes over and he kind of picks up on what they're doing, that this cat figurine is at the center of attention. And, you know, Susan and the girls are telling him, don't do anything, don't touch it. And he takes the figurine and he walks out to the back deck and he throws it onto their backyard. And Susan and the girls are crying because they're like, oh my gosh, you're going to make this so much worse. Everybody's attention is towards the backyard. When they all turn around to look at the mantle, Matt thinking he had solved the problem, there is a figurine, an identical one of the cat that's sitting on the table again. They all gasp, they can't believe it, and it doesn't make any sense. They watched Matt throw the figurine. Matt doesn't care, picks it up and throws it on the ground and smashes it right then and there. And it's just this crazy sequence of events that when you hear the firsthand interviews with Susan, she can barely describe this moment because you're seeing something reappear. And then Matt is destroying it. It's like a very deliberate, aggressive act towards this thing in the house. The very opposite of what it was meant to do. And Susan would say that she knew they were going to go through hell for that. That night, after everybody finally fell asleep, Jamie wakes up in the middle of the night and goes down into the kitchen to get a snack. When she goes in there, she sees written all over the walls, everywhere, is the word cat. Everywhere. And she immediately runs upstairs. She gets her mom, she gets Matt and Marie. Everybody sees that there's this word cat written everywhere. Matt looks at Jamie and says, you're the one that found this. You did this. Susan comes to defend Jamie and says, you're the one, Matt, that smashed the cat figurine. There's no wonder this is happening. And so this horrible fight happens where they aren't seeing what's actually going on. They're just seeing red and fighting with each other. Meanwhile, they're blatantly being haunted. In addition to cat being written everywhere, the house had been completely ransacked. I mean, everything's been dumped out of drawers. Everywhere that you could make a mess, there had been a mess made. And no one woke up to it. They were all in bed. No one woke up to this much of a mess. It didn't make any sense. They start cleaning up this horrible mess. And as they move some things aside in the kitchen, they find what looks to be a huge footprint. It is not Matt's footprint. It's certainly not one of the girls' footprints. It's easy for us to say, well, why didn't you go to the police? But you got to remember that when you're in real crisis mode, your brain will tell you that everything is fine. It will be in complete denial of things that are right in front of you because it's a coping mechanism. And so they did nothing and just let it continue. Susan desperately wanted to leave the house, but she couldn't do it financially. They couldn't leave the house. They couldn't afford to, so they're trapped. At this point, the kids are getting very withdrawn. They don't want to be in the house, so Marie would end up staying in her room all day. Jamie would do the same thing. Matt and Susan weren't talking. There was just nothing being done to correct the situation, and everybody was so upset and angry with each other. It was just a worst case scenario. So in the last couple of weeks that they ever stayed at this house, because they would leave, two major events occurred. The first one happened when Marie was home alone. She was only going to be there for a couple hours by herself, and even though Susan and Matt did not want to leave her alone, they didn't have another choice, and Jamie wasn't there. So Marie's going to be home alone, and it's nighttime. So this is like straight out of a horror movie. She's sitting in the living room watching TV, and at some point the TV starts turning off and on. So off on, off on, off on, and she knows, because she's been in this house now and seen the craziness, that something bad's about to happen. And the TV finally just turns off. She can't get it on. She reaches for the remote. The remote flies off the table. And now she's just sitting there frozen because she knows that something's in the house with her. She watches as the rocking chair right in front of her just starts to rock back and forth, as if the person or thing that had pulled away the remote had walked over and sat down in the rocking chair and was now looking at her rocking back and forth. Marie is looking at the rocking chair as all the pictures on the walls just start one by one falling off the wall. Marie and Jamie had a habit of always having a digital camera with them at all times because they were taking pictures and filming everything strange happening in their house. And so as she's laying there, just absolutely horrified, she takes her camera in her hand and kind of turns it and just starts taking pictures of the room before running out of the room to get her phone, where she calls Susan, she calls her dad, she calls everybody. She's screaming into the phone, you got to get here, something's going on. And Susan flies home, Jamie flies home, they rush inside and they grab her and she's unhurt, but the house has once again been tossed. And then after it all kind of settles down, Marie says, I took pictures. And so Susan and Matt and Jamie look at these pictures. There are these weird orbs of light that are very clearly in the room with her, that are moving around the room. She managed to get a couple pictures of them, and they're just totally out of this world. At this point, Matt is convinced that there's something paranormal happening in the house. He's not even putting up the charade that this is Jamie, because it wasn't. It wasn't his daughter. It wasn't anybody. How can you explain these pictures? You can't. And so Matt decides, well, I don't know who we call for this, but I think you call the church. And so he tried calling a bunch of priests and pastors and tried to get anybody to come over. And the best he could do was get a pastor to come over and pray with them before leaving and saying, we can't help you. And so they were totally on their own, and they can't afford to leave. They know something horrible is happening here, and they're just trapped. And finally, the second major event that occurred in those final 2 weeks happened to Jamie when she was home alone. Jamie was in her room and she starts hearing pounding on her door. She started filming this pounding on her door. There's no one home with her. And you just hear in her voice that she's terrified and someone is pounding over and over on the door, on her bedroom door. And at some point she knows she has to go into the hall. And so she goes over to the door. She's building the strength to reach down and open the door. And as soon as her hand would go near the doorknob, the pounding on the other side of the door would stop. Like it knew she was about to come out into the hall. And so she didn't open the door, and she went back onto her bed and she just sat there in the fetal position for 3 hours, listening to something smashing nonstop into the door. At some point, the banging stops. And after a few minutes of the banging being done, she thinks this is her chance to escape the house. She opens the door and there's no one there. But the door on the outside, where the knocking had been happening, there's this huge dent and divot in the door. And the door handle on the outside, from the hallway side, has been bent downward. On the ground in the hall is a pile of utensils, pots, pans, silverware, knives. This thing had been using tools to try to open the door. Next door to her room was a bathroom, and the bathroom door did not have a doorknob on it. You basically just pushed it shut. But there was a space for a doorknob that you could actually look through. They just hadn't put it on there yet. And she noticed in the bathroom that the light was flickering. And she thought, I think it's in there. And she decides she's going to try to trap this thing. So she goes to her desk where she had some string. She goes back over and loops the string through this hole in the door and leans back and pulls the door shut, thinking she's trapped this thing inside. As soon as she does, she starts feeling resistance on the door. Someone is pulling back. And at some point, the string gets cut and she falls back into her room. At which point, the bathroom door swings open and she says, I'm about to come face to face with something out of my nightmares. But before she could see this thing come out of the bathroom, her bedroom door slams shut. And she hears the rustling of pans and tools and metal clinking against each other right outside her door. She knows this thing is interacting with all those tools and pots and pans right on the other side of her door. It's this horrifying thought. And after just a moment or two, she sees smoke coming into her bedroom. And so she immediately runs to the door to try to open it. And when she does, she sees that now there is a frying pan sitting in the hall that has a toilet paper roll completely on fire. And that there's been toilet paper strewn all over the hallway. Like this is a wick and it's gonna light the hallway on fire. She grabs a sweatshirt and she smothers the fire. At this point, she's in full survival mode. She knows she has to get out of this house. It's trying to kill her. And so she walks down this hall, pulling aside all of the toilet paper, getting ready to come face to face with this horrible thing. She goes into the living room. The whole thing has been covered in toilet paper, paper towels. Papers have been strewn everywhere. This thing was trying to light the house on fire with her trapped inside. And so she manages to make her way through this maze of toilet paper. She sees there's no other fire set, and she goes outside defeated and just sits on the front steps of her house, waiting for her mom to come back. Susan, Matt, and Marie were all together, so they came back and they saw Jamie sitting on the front steps just crying. They go inside, they see the scene. Jamie explains what happens, and that was it. They knew they were going to have to go bankrupt to leave the house. They did not have the money to leave, but they had to leave. And so they barely packed up and they left that house. It didn't sell. Susan literally went bankrupt. And soon after they left the neighborhood, their neighbors left the neighborhood, and 5 other neighbors in their immediate vicinity all left. All of the houses did not sell. They are all vacant. No one knows why. Susan, Jamie, Matt, and Marie, since leaving that neighborhood, even though they were ruined financially, They were very happy to get out of there. They've had no other paranormal activity since they left, and they're just glad they got out of there with their lives.